Hi, and welcome back to Gardog the Gamorrean Star Wars Miniatures tutorials. In my first video, we discussed the maps used and basic movement of characters. Now, we want to take that a bit further, and look at a couple of the more advanced movement techniques. The first one I want to discuss is moving diagonally. Characters can move diagonally, but it costs 2 squares of movement, which makes sense when you compare it to standard movement. But if it doesn't save you any movement, why bother moving diagonally? Well, in my 9th video, we learnt all about attacks of opportunity. Moving diagonally can sometimes help you to avoid granting attacks of opportunity to your enemies. Let's look at an example. Here we have Han, and he wants to move to here. If he moved in a conventional manner, either this way or this way, it would provoke an attack of opportunity by either Darth Vader or the Stormtrooper. But if Han was to move diagonally like this, he would never occupy a square adjacent to an enemy, so neither enemy would be eligible to make an attack of opportunity. Like many of the rules, there are a few important restrictions to be aware of if you are planning to move diagonally. Firstly, you can't move diagonally if either of the opposing diagonal squares are occupied by an enemy. Second, if you move diagonally into a square that is designated as either difficult terrain or low objects, it would count as 4 squares of movement, 2 for the diagonal, and another 2 for the terrain. And the third restriction is that you can't move diagonally across the corner of a wall, unless the magenta line on the map clearly indicates that the wall does not extend all of the way to the end of the square. The other topic I would like to talk about in this video is squeezing. Squeezing can only apply to large and huge characters. In other words, any characters that occupy more than a single square. Large and huge characters can squeeze through small openings and narrow hallways, provided that the space is at least half the size of the character. So, a large character that occupies 2 by 2 squares can squeeze through a single square, while a huge character, which occupies 3 by 3 squares, couldn't. They can only squeeze through a 2 square wide gap. And just like moving diagonally, there are a couple of restrictions we need to take into consideration if we are thinking of squeezing. The first is that, as always, characters must end their turn in legal, unoccupied squares. They can't end their turn occupying any squares already occupied by an enemy, or designated as a pit, or a solid wall. And just so you don't get any grand ideas, no, you can't occupy squares on either side of a thin wall. The second restriction is that characters can only squeeze between 3 types of map features. They are walls, closed doors, and pits. And lastly, there must be a wall, a closed door, or a pit on both sides of the squares they are squeezing through. Characters can't squeeze between enemy characters, low objects, rough terrain, or just so they can avoid granting an attack of opportunity. Let's look at a couple of examples of squeezing. Firstly, we have this Yuzum. As you can see, it is a large character, which occupies 2 by 2 squares. The Yuzum would like to move to here. Even though this section is only 1 square wide, the Yuzum could squeeze through the narrow section and move to the desired squares. But, you will notice that it took the Yuzum 7 squares of movement to reach where it wanted to go. The Yuzum has the standard speed of 6, which means it can't attack and move 7 squares in the same turn. We couldn't simply stop after 6 squares of movement to enable it to make an attack, because it would have ended its turn occupying an illegal square. While still looking at that same section of map, let's swap the Yuzum for Jabba's pet Rancor, which is a huge character, occupying 3 by 3 squares. The Rancor couldn't squeeze through this part, which is only 1 square wide. It would have to take a longer route, squeezing through this 2 square wide area. The last thing you need to be aware of regarding squeezing is that some large and huge characters are specifically prevented from squeezing by a special ability called Rigid. A couple of examples are the Republic's AT-RT and the Imperials ATST. As you could imagine, they couldn't squeeze through a narrow gap because they are made of solid metal. But that isn't always the case. The Rebel Snowspeeder is a huge character, occupying 3x3 squares, and would also be made of solid metal, but that doesn't have the rigid ability. If you think about it, a snowspeeder could flip onto its side while flying, to slip through a narrower, 2-square wide gap. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me for my next video where we'll take a more in-depth look at the doors, and a couple of special abilities that can affect the opening and closing of them.